If you've ever wondered how far an HOA president will go to show their power, you won't believe this story. Imagine standing in the middle of your worst heartbreak, and then someone decides to make it worse for no reason other than control. That's exactly what happened to me, and it all began the morning of my wife's funeral. Before I dive in, make sure you like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching this from. I love seeing where people around the world hear these unbelievable HOA stories. Now, let's get into it. The morning air was heavy with grief as I prepared to bury my wife. Friends and family had gathered from out of state, caravanning behind the hearse as it carried her coffin from the funeral home to our community's small private cemetery. I lived on a large property within a gated neighborhood, and while the HOA technically oversaw the shared areas, my land was deeded long before they were even formed. My wife and I had always kept to ourselves, and I thought that would protect us from their nonsense. I was wrong. The convoy approached the gate slowly, headlights glowing in a solemn line. At the front, just behind the hearse, I sat in my truck. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I could feel the leather bite into my palms. Everything felt surreal. And then it happened. The gate didn't open. At first, I thought it was a mechanical glitch. But then, stepping out from a white SUV, came Karen, the HOA president herself. She was dressed not for mourning, but for confrontation, her clipboard in hand like a sword. She walked directly into the path of the hearse, holding up her hand as if she had the authority to stop death itself. The funeral director, utterly confused, stopped the vehicle. The convoy behind us braked one by one, confusion rippling through the mourners. And there, at the gate of the neighborhood where my wife had lived for 20 years, her coffin was halted like an uninvited guest. I got out of my truck, heart pounding in disbelief. Karen stood firm, lips pursed, demanding to know why the funeral procession hadn't received proper clearance from the HOA. She accused me of breaking rules, of bringing too many cars into the neighborhood, of creating a disruption. At that moment, it wasn't just about her need for control, it was cruelty, plain and simple. Neighbors peeked out from their homes, some stepping onto porches to watch. The sight of a grieving husband arguing with an HOA president in front of his wife's coffin was beyond grotesque. But Karen thrived on spectacle, and she seemed to relish that all eyes were on her. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't budge. She insisted that rules are rules, and if I wanted to proceed, I would need to pay an immediate violation fine for unauthorized use of the gate. The mourners sat in their cars, some weeping, others seething in disbelief. The entire funeral had ground to a halt because one woman wanted to wield her power. Minutes dragged into half an hour. My wife's coffin sat baking in the sun, the funeral procession stuck, all because Karen refused to lift the gate arm. My grief was morphing into a cold, focused fury. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about rules or gates. This was about humiliation. She wanted control, even over my pain. Finally, I walked over to the hearse and looked at the funeral director. His face was pale, unsure how to proceed. Families whispered in the cars behind us, growing restless. My wife deserved dignity. She deserved peace. And here we were, trapped like trespassers. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors, a quiet man who usually avoided conflict, stepped out from his porch and shouted at Karen to let us through. Others followed, their voices joining together in a chorus of defiance. They told her she had gone too far, that this wasn't about HOA policy anymore, it was about basic humanity. But Karen, ever stubborn, doubled down. She screamed at the neighbors to get back inside, accusing them of harassment. She claimed she was within her authority, that the HOA had every right to control traffic through the gates, and if anyone disagreed, they could take it up with the board. The standoff stretched, emotions fraying at the edges. I knew something had to give. My mind turned from grief to strategy. If she thought this was about power, then it was time to show her real authority. Karen had no idea that while I was a homeowner like everyone else, I also had deeper connections. Legal ones, professional ones, the kind that could end her reign of intimidation permanently. But that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about getting my wife to her resting place. So quietly, I stepped back and made a phone call. Not to the police, but to someone with far more sway when it came to matters of property and law. Within minutes, a vehicle pulled up behind our convoy, a county sheriff's cruiser, lights flashing. Karen's smirk faltered when the deputy stepped out. The neighbors cheered, the tension breaking like a storm. The deputy walked over, listened to Karen rant, and then calmly asked her to move aside. She tried to wave her clipboard, claiming jurisdiction. But authority that day didn't belong to her. It belonged to the law. Finally, under pressure, Karen backed down. The gate arm lifted, and the procession moved forward. My wife's coffin was carried through, at last, heading toward peace. The neighbors stood silently as the cars rolled by, many bowing their heads in respect. But I know this wasn't over. Karen had crossed a line so vile, so deeply personal, that there would have to be consequences. She thought she could use grief as a weapon. She thought wrong. That day, I buried my wife, but in my heart, I also buried any patience I had left for Karen's reign of cruelty. The real battle was about to begin. The day of my wife's funeral ended with a quiet burial, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors who stood with me against the cruelty of the HOA president. The coffin lowered into the earth, roses tossed onto the lid, prayers whispered into the wind. But even as I stood by her grave, grief mingling with silence, my mind churned with what had happened at the gate. Karen had not only disrespected my wife's final journey, but she had also humiliated me, mocked the grieving process of an entire family, and brought shame to the neighborhood. For many, it would have ended at the graveyard, with people shaking their heads and saying, "She went too far." But for me, it was the beginning of something else. It was the day I decided Karen would be held accountable. The morning after, the calls started. Friends who had attended the funeral shared their disbelief with others, and word spread quickly. Soon, almost every homeowner in the neighborhood knew about the incident. Some were outraged, but others, the ones who secretly supported Karen's iron grip, dismissed it as exaggeration. But there was no exaggeration. The sight of a coffin blocked at the gates of our community was real, and too many had seen it. I began collecting accounts. Mourners who had been in the convoy sent me photos and videos they had taken on their phones. You could see the coffin inside the hearse. You could see Karen standing in front of it like a guard, clipboard clutched in hand. Neighbors' voices could be heard in the background, urging her to stop. It wasn't just proof. It was damning evidence. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, she claimed she had only been following procedure and blamed the funeral director for not filing proper paperwork. She portrayed herself as the victim, saying she had been attacked by aggressive neighbors who didn't respect her position. Her allies on the board nodded in agreement, eager to protect her. But cracks were forming. People who had always stayed silent began speaking up. A widow who lived 2 streets over recounted how Karen once fined her for leaving her garbage bin out for 7 minutes too long. Another man shared how Karen had sent him violation notices for having his son's bike left on the porch. Slowly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was abusing power. I bided my time, building a case. My career before retirement taught me patience, discipline, and how to handle adversaries who believed themselves untouchable. Karen thought she was safe because she had the HOA bylaws on her side. What she didn't realize was that bylaws don't stand against the weight of public opinion, the scrutiny of local officials, and the exposure of truth. Within weeks, I had gathered dozens of statements, videos, and photos, not just from my incident, but from years of her behavior. It was enough to show a clear pattern of abuse. But instead of rushing forward, I took another step. I brought it to the local news. The reporter I contacted was stunned. The headline almost wrote itself, "HOA President Blocks Funeral Procession at Neighborhood Gate." The station ran the story that same week, accompanied by clips of the video from the funeral. The community was horrified. Viewers across the county left comments on social media calling Karen heartless, cruel, and unfit to hold any position of authority. The pressure grew. Karen's name became synonymous with tyranny in suburbia. Neighbors who had once feared her began to speak out openly. Some even knocked on my door offering support and telling me their own horror stories. Each tale was more absurd than the last. Fines for lawn decorations, threats over Christmas lights, even warnings about children playing too loudly in their own driveways. But Karen wasn't one to retreat. She responded to the news coverage by hiring a lawyer, sending out letters accusing me of defamation. She claimed the video had been misrepresented and that I was orchestrating a smear campaign to overthrow her leadership. I knew better. This wasn't about leadership. It was about human decency. The HOA board, now caught in the middle, scrambled to control the chaos. Emergency meetings were held. Some members argued that Karen had to step down, while others feared legal consequences if they admitted wrongdoing. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. People no longer waved at each other with casual friendliness. They whispered, they pointed, they speculated about what would happen next. Through it all, I stayed calm. I wasn't acting out of rage anymore. I was acting out of principle. Karen had insulted my wife's memory, and she had poisoned a community for too long. It was time for her to face the reality she had created. Then came the breaking point. A local council member, after seeing the news report and receiving dozens of complaints, announced that an investigation into the HOA would be launched. Questions of misuse of power, unlawful fines, and harassment were now officially on the table. Karen could no longer hide behind her clipboard or her small circle of supporters. The HOA meeting was unlike any I had ever attended. The room was packed wall to wall, neighbors standing against the walls, arms crossed, eyes narrow at Karen. The air was electric with anticipation. Karen still tried to project confidence, gavel in hand, but her voice cracked as she struggled to maintain order. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't shout, I didn't rant. I simply laid out the facts, the funeral, the photos, the videos, the testimonies. Each word weighed heavier than the last. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, neighbors stood and demanded her resignation. Karen refused. She claimed the entire neighborhood was being manipulated. She pointed at me, accusing me of plotting revenge, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Her voice grew shrill, almost desperate. And that's when I realized something. Karen wasn't going to step down willingly. She wasn't going to apologize. Not now, not ever. Unless she was forced to. As the meeting descended into shouting, I quietly resolved that the fight wasn't over. Not until Karen looked me in the eye and in front of everyone admitted she was wrong. The coffin she tried to stop deserved that dignity. My wife deserved that dignity, and I was going to make sure Karen gave it. The neighborhood had reached a point of no return. After weeks of tension, news coverage, and growing resentment, Karen stood alone at the center of a storm she had created. The HOA board was fractured, homeowners were united in outrage, and officials had started to look into her leadership with skeptical eyes. Yet Karen clung to power like a drowning sailor clutching driftwood. For me, the fight was no longer about bylaws, meetings, or fines. It was about my wife, about the dignity that was stolen when a grieving family was stopped at a gate by a woman who thought rules outweighed respect. And until Karen faced what she had done, I knew peace would not come to me or to this community. The day of reckoning arrived at the next HOA meeting, announced in bold letters on flyers taped to mailboxes and community boards. Special session, discussion of HOA president conduct. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a trial. When I arrived, the clubhouse was packed with neighbors, reporters, and even city officials who had been invited to observe. Cameras lined the back wall, lenses catching every movement, every expression. Karen sat at the front table, her face stiff, eyes darting nervously at the crowd. She wore her usual uniform of pressed blazer and pearl necklace, but the confidence she once carried had drained from her posture. The board opened the floor. One after another, residents came forward, recounting stories of harassment, unreasonable fines, and intimidation. Each testimony piled weight onto Karen's crumbling reputation. A father told of his son being reprimanded for drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. A veteran described being threatened with penalties for flying a flag outside his home. A mother shared how Karen once told her that her child's wheelchair ramp didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. By the time they finished, the air in the room was thick with disgust. Karen shifted in her seat, fingers clutching her gavel so tightly her knuckles whitened. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, carrying a small photo frame in my hand. It was a picture of my wife, smiling under the summer sun, holding a basket of flowers from our garden. I placed it gently on the table beside me and looked out at the crowd. With steady words, I recounted that day. The hearse, the blocked gate, the waiting cars, the humiliation of explaining to mourners why we were stuck outside our own community. The videos played on a projector, casting Karen's image across the wall for everyone to see. The silence in the room was absolute. No one could deny it anymore. When the footage ended, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said that all I wanted was an acknowledgement, a simple apology for my wife, whose final journey had been marred by cruelty disguised as authority. The board whispered among themselves, then turned to Karen. They asked her to respond. Karen stood, trembling, her voice unsteady. She began by insisting that rules were rules, that her actions had been procedural, but the crowd erupted in murmurs of disapproval. People shook their heads, some outright booed. The weight of the room pressed down on her, and for the first time, she looked cornered. Her eyes flicked toward me, then to the photo of my wife. Her lip quivered. And there it was, the crack in her armor. The pressure was too much. Karen lowered her gaze, shoulders sagging. With a shaking breath, she muttered words no one expected to hear from her. She admitted she was wrong. She admitted she had gone too far. And finally, after weeks of denial, she apologized, not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. The room erupted, not with cheers, but with a strange, heavy silence. It was the sound of justice settling. People looked at me, waiting to see how I would respond. I nodded once. That was enough. I hadn't come for revenge. I had come for respect. And at last, even Karen had been forced to give it. But the story didn't end there. The board, under mounting pressure from homeowners and officials, announced a vote of no confidence. The ballots were cast that same evening, and by a landslide, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president. For the first time in years, the community felt free. The following weeks brought change. The new board members promised transparency, fairness, and compassion. Rules were still enforced, but not weaponized. Families decorated their homes without fear of letters in the mail. Children played freely, flags waved proudly, and neighbors began to rebuild trust. As for Karen, she faded into the background. Stripped of her authority, she became just another resident. Some neighbors avoided her, others ignored her completely. The woman who once ruled with an iron fist now walked with her head down, a shadow of the figure she once tried to be. For me, closure finally arrived when I returned to my wife's grave one quiet afternoon. I placed fresh flowers on the headstone,
and sat in silence. The apology, though reluctant, had been made. The neighborhood was healing. And in that moment, I felt she would have been proud, not of the battle, but of the dignity reclaimed. The fight against Karen was never about power. It was about honor, about standing firm when cruelty threatened compassion. And in the end, that is what prevailed.